History remembers many acts of cruelty, but some are so personal, so intimate, that they feel like nightmares rather than reality. This is the story of a man who ruled an empire, yet could not control his obsession. A story where grief became madness and madness became an unthinkable crime. In the year 65 AD, Emperor Nero lost his wife, but instead of letting her rest, he decided to bring her back, not in spirit, not in memory, but in flesh. The victim was a teenage boy, and what happened to him would become one of the most disturbing cases of identity theft in human history. This is not legend, this is recorded fact, and once you hear it, you will never forget the name Sporus, Rome, 65 AD. The empire was at the height of its glory, stretching from the wind-swept cliffs of Britannia to the burning sands of Arabia. The capital pulsed with life, merchants shouting in the markets, senators wrapped in crisp white togas plotting in marble halls, and soldiers clanking in the streets with shields catching the midday sun. At the center of it all stood the Palatine Hill, where the golden corridors of the imperial palace gleamed under the watchful gaze of its master, Emperor Nero. He was a man both feared and adored, a ruler who played the lyre as well as he commanded armies, who fancied himself an artist, but carried the will of a tyrant in his heart. And in that summer he had something, or rather, someone, he loved above all else: Poppaea Sabina, the empress of Rome. Her beauty was sung of in whispered tavern songs, and compared to Venus herself. Her amber hair fell like molten gold over her shoulders, her skin was pale and flawless, her voice soft yet sharp enough to wound. She was more than just the emperor's consort, she was his obsession, his muse, and in many ways his mirror. Ambitious, calculating, and unafraid to step over corpses to get what she wanted. Poppaea's influence over Nero was the talk of the empire. She was said to have whispered in his ear to rid himself of anyone who threatened their power. Friends were exiled, rivals executed, family members banished to the far edges of the provinces. Even the empress's rise to power had been paved with scandal. She had been the wife of another before Nero claimed her, a move that angered the nobility but delighted those who thrived on palace gossip. Still, to Nero, none of it mattered. She was the center of his world, and her every smile could calm the storms of his mind. Until the day it all came to an end. The accounts of her death are shrouded in contradiction, buried under centuries of retellings by historians who love to paint Nero in the darkest light. Some say she died of natural causes during pregnancy, her fragile body unable to bear the weight of new life. Others whisper a more brutal tale, that in a fit of rage, Nero struck her down, his blow ending both her life and that of the unborn child. The ancient historian Suetonius wrote of this with grim relish, describing a scene of violence that left Rome's upper class horrified yet silent. In truth, the exact moment of her death has been lost to time, but what is certain is that the palace walls absorbed the shock like a wound that would never heal. The city outside carried on with its daily chaos, but within the palace, the air was different. The grand corridors, usually echoing with the steps of servants and the laughter of feasts, were muffled with dread. Torches burned low even during the day, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the throne. Nero was seen pacing at night, his bare feet slapping against the cold marble, his voice murmuring her name again and again. Servants who passed him in the halls dared not meet his gaze. He was the emperor, but grief had unmoored him from reality. There were nights when he would stand before her empty chambers, staring into the darkness as though expecting her to step through the doorway at any moment. Outside, the whispers began almost immediately. Rome's citizens speculated on the cause of the empress's death, their voices a mixture of fear and fascination. The city's poets, always eager to court favor with the imperial family, penned verses of mourning, likening her passing to the dimming of the moon. In the Senate, a few cautious voices wondered what her absence would mean for the balance of power. For years, Poppaea had been the shadow behind the emperor's throne, her council shaping his decrees, her tastes dictating the empire's style and etiquette. Now that she was gone, what would fill the void? Few could guess that the answer would be something far stranger than politics or court intrigue. In the weeks that followed, Nero ordered grand displays of mourning. Statues of Poppaea were draped in black, offerings of flowers and incense piled high at the steps of her memorial. Musicians played slow, aching laments in the public squares. Yet, for all the spectacle, there was something deeply unsettling in the way Nero clung to her image. He commissioned countless portraits to be painted in her likeness, had her face etched into gems, coins, and silver goblets. In the gardens of the palace, he ordered the planting of her favorite flowers so their scent would drift through his windows. And still, none of it was enough. Those closest to him began to notice a change in his demeanor. The emperor, who once relished public performances and grand banquets, withdrew into private chambers, emerging only rarely and often in a state of distraction. He spoke to those around him as though she were still alive, making casual references to what Poppaea would have liked or will decide in matters of state. Some servants reported hearing him speaking into empty rooms late at night, his voice low and affectionate. To them, it was as though Nero had slipped into another world entirely, one in which Poppaea had never died. In this fragile state of mind, something began to take root, an idea both impossible and monstrous. Nero had the wealth of the empire, the loyalty of its armies, and the fear of its citizens. In his hands, there was no desire too extravagant, no whim too dangerous to pursue. If death had taken Poppaea from him, then perhaps death could be defied. He had sculptors who could mimic her face in marble, actors who could imitate her gestures, artists who could capture her smile on canvas. But these were cold imitations. What he craved was not an image or a statue. He wanted her back in the flesh, breathing, moving, standing beside him once again. And in his mind, there was only one way to achieve this. What began as grief hardened into obsession. The emperor started to speak of finding her again, as though somewhere in the vast reaches of the empire, Poppaea lived on in another form. He ordered his servants and advisors to keep their eyes open for anyone who bore the faintest resemblance to the empress. His words carried the weight of an imperial command, and no one dared question the madness in them. This was not a search for a new wife or a simple replacement. Nero's desire was far more disturbing. He did not want someone like Poppaea. He wanted Poppaea herself, no matter the cost, no matter the nature of the transformation required. Rome's summer heat pressed down like a suffocating hand as the emperor's private search began to take shape. Nero no longer appeared in the Senate, and public entertainments became infrequent. His absence from the games and theaters sent ripples of unease through the city. The people had grown accustomed to their ruler's flamboyant performances. In truth, Nero was still performing, just not for the public. Behind the thick walls of the imperial palace, his mind was scripting a very different kind of drama. It started with quiet instructions to a handful of trusted attendants and freedmen. These were men who understood that the emperor's wishes were not to be questioned, only obeyed. They were sent to the corners of the empire with vague but chilling orders: observe, report, and bring word of anyone whose face, bearing, or beauty mirrored that of the late Poppaea Sabina. Messengers rode out under the guise of imperial business, inspectors for the grain supply, recruiters for the Praetorian Guard. But their true task was much stranger. Their letters back to Rome were not filled with matters of trade or law, but with physical descriptions of strangers: the tilt of a chin, the curve of a cheekbone, the color of hair in the midday sun. At first, the search turned up nothing that satisfied Nero's insatiable demand. The reports described beautiful women, noble matrons, even young slaves whose features carried some distant echo of the empress. But Nero was uninterested in faint resemblance. He dismissed each candidate with scorn, sometimes tearing the letters in two in front of his attendants. What he wanted was not a shadow or suggestion. He wanted the exact vision that haunted him, the living ghost of the woman he had lost. The failure of his search only deepened his mood. The palace became a place of whispered dread. Servants spoke in hushed voices, aware that the emperor's temper was as unstable as it was dangerous. Then, one afternoon, the first spark of interest appeared. A freedman named Fane returned from a journey through the Italian countryside with a strange piece of news. In the household of a wealthy Roman knight lived a youth, barely past boyhood, whose face, Fane claimed, could have been carved from the same marble mold as Poppaea's. His eyes, he said, were almond-shaped and luminous. His skin held the same pale luster, his mouth curved in the same delicate, almost cruel smile. The boy's name was Sporus. Nero's interest was piqued at once. He questioned Fane for hours, pressing him for every detail. How tall was the boy? How did he carry himself? Did his voice match the softness of his features? Was his hair the same shade of Poppaea's? Fane answered each question with care, aware that the emperor's reaction could swing from favor to fury in a heartbeat. By the end of the conversation, Nero's decision was made. Sporus was to be brought to him immediately, without delay, without explanation. The summons was less an invitation than a command. Sporus, though young, was not naive. He had heard the stories of Nero's unpredictability, his wrath, and his whims. The journey to Rome was heavy with dread. No one summoned by the emperor could know their fate until they stood in his presence. The boy arrived at the palace in the early evening, when the last light of day still touched the gilded columns and the air smelled faintly of incense. He was led through a series of corridors lined with statues of gods and past murals depicting triumphs of the imperial house. Each step seemed to carry him further away from the world he had known and deeper into the emperor's strange domain. When Nero finally saw him, the transformation in his expression was unmistakable. The emperor, who had been slouched in his chair moments before, sat up straight, his eyes fixed on the boy as if he had seen a ghost. He circled Sporus slowly, examining every detail of his face with the intensity of a sculptor judging his own work. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint hiss of burning oil lamps. Then, in a voice both soft and chilling, he murmured, "Yes, she has returned." From that moment, Sporus's life was no longer his own. Nero did not send him away, nor did he treat him as a guest. Instead, the boy was lodged in a private suite near the emperor's own quarters, his meals and clothing provided by the imperial staff. The garments he received were not the tunics and cloaks of a young Roman male, but fine silks, embroidered robes, and jeweled accessories unmistakably feminine in design. There was no question in anyone's mind the emperor had not found a replacement for his wife. He intended to recreate her. The reaction within the palace was one of silent horror. Those who served Nero had seen him commit acts of cruelty before, but this was something different. It was not rage or punishment. It was obsession made flesh. Some whispered that the gods had cursed him with madness for the crimes he had committed. Others believed he was possessed by some dark compulsion no mortal could resist. But none dared to speak their thoughts aloud. In the Roman court, the wrong word could end in exile or death. Beyond the palace walls, the people of Rome began to notice small, strange changes. The emperor appeared in public less often, and when he did, there were rumors of a beautiful figure glimpsed at his side, a figure whose identity no one could quite confirm. In the markets and baths, speculation grew. Had Nero taken a new lover so soon after Poppaea's death? Was the empress, as some wildly claimed, alive after all? These whispers never reached the full truth, but they hinted at the unease that was beginning to seep into the city's perception of its ruler. Inside the palace, the line between the dead and the living began to blur. Nero spoke to Sporus in the same intimate tones he had once reserved for Poppaea. He instructed the boy in the empress's mannerisms, correcting him if his posture faltered or his gestures lacked grace. Servants were ordered to address him with the same honorifics they had once used for the empress. This was not merely resemblance anymore. It was the first stage of transformation, and behind Nero's watchful eyes lay a plan that would soon strip Sporus of the last remnants of his former self. It was a search that had begun as a madman's wish, a hunt through the far reaches of the empire for an echo of the past. Now, with Sporus standing in the emperor's shadow, the search was over. But in ending it, Nero had set in motion something far worse. The boy who had been chosen for his face was about to be remade in ways he could not yet imagine, trapped in a role that was not his own, unable to escape the grasp of the most powerful man in the known world. And in Nero's mind, the image of Poppaea was no longer a memory. It was standing before him, breathing, ready to be shaped into perfection. Sporus had been born into a Rome that was dazzling on the surface but brutal beneath, a place where a person's fate could shift with the change of a single mood in the imperial palace. He was a child of the late Julio, Claudian age, when the city's streets overflowed with wealth from conquered lands, and the air was thick with the scent of spices, perfumes, and smoke from endless banquets. Yet, for all its splendor, Rome was not a kind place for those without power. Sporus had grown up in a household that was neither noble nor impoverished, somewhere in the fragile middle ground of Roman society, where survival depended on caution, obedience, and the favor of those above. His family's name is lost to history, as is the story of how they came into the service of the knight whose household he later lived in. But what is clear is that Sporus's beauty had been noticed long before Nero's search began. From his earliest years, his features drew attention, delicate and refined in a way that defied the coarse expectations of Roman masculinity. His skin was pale and unmarked by the sun, his hair a soft shade that caught the light in a way that seemed almost unnatural. His eyes carried a quiet intensity, and his expressions, though naturally his own, possessed an elegance that reminded people of the portraits of noblewomen. In another life, in another time, these qualities might have been a harmless curiosity, but in Rome, beauty could be as dangerous as treason. In the household of the knight, Sporus was valued, not for his strength or labor, but for his refinement. He learned to move with measured grace, to speak softly and clearly, to serve wine without spilling a drop, to read the expressions of his superiors before they spoke. He lived in a world where his safety depended on pleasing those in power and avoiding any hint of disobedience. These skills would later be twisted into the tools of his survival. He was not a free man in the sense that Romans prided themselves on. His life was, in many ways, already in the hands of others, but he had some measure of stability. That stability shattered the moment Nero's gaze fell upon him. When Faun, the freedman, first saw him, Sporus was tending to a minor duty in the courtyard of the knight's estate, perhaps carrying a tray of wine or arranging flowers for a household shrine. Whatever he was doing, it was ordinary, but the effect was extraordinary. Phaon froze. He could not shake the resemblance. The angle of the boy's jaw, the arch of his brows, the faintly knowing way his lips rested even when he wasn't speaking. It was as if Poppaea Sabina herself, years younger, had been reborn in the skin of a youth. He said nothing at first, but the image stayed with him for the rest of the day, gnawing at his thoughts until he knew it had to be reported. When the imperial summons arrived, it was swift and impossible to refuse. Sporus was told only that the emperor had requested his presence in Rome. The words were dressed in the polite language of honor, but everyone understood the truth. No one, requested by the emperor, had any choice. The journey to the capital was not one of excitement, but of dread. He traveled under guard, fed and clothed adequately, but always aware that he was being delivered like a rare offering to a man whose reputation was as terrifying as it was magnificent. The palace was unlike anything Sporus had ever seen. The sheer size of it was overwhelming. Endless corridors lined with marble statues, floors polished to a mirror, like shine, walls painted with scenes of gods and battles. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, mingling with the distant notes of music played in the emperor's private chambers. Servants moved quickly and silently, their eyes lowered. The atmosphere was one of constant tension, as though the entire building was holding its breath. When he finally stood before Nero, Sporus felt the weight of the emperor's gaze in his bones. The ruler did not greet him with the formality of a stranger. Instead, Nero stared at him in silence, eyes narrowing as he moved closer, circling the boy as one might circle a priceless statue, searching for flaws. Sporus stood motionless, unsure whether to speak or bow or simply endure the inspection. The silence stretched on until Nero finally spoke, not to him, but to the attendants in the room. "It is her," he said softly. "Poppaea has returned." From that moment forward, Sporus was no longer addressed by his own name. Servants were instructed to treat him with the same deference they had once shown the empress. Clothing was brought to him: silks, fine linens, delicate sandals, and embroidered veils. He was made to bathe in scented oils, his hair styled in the manner of Poppaea's. Jewelry that had once belonged to the empress herself was placed around his neck and wrists. The transformation began not with force, but with an eerie, suffocating inevitability. Refusal was unthinkable. In the days that followed, Sporus began to understand the strange, inescapable role he had been given. Nero did not treat him as a simple concubine or servant. The emperor insisted on teaching him the empress's gestures, her way of sitting, the exact tilt of her head when listening to someone speak. He spoke to Sporus as if he truly believed he was Poppaea reborn, recounting memories they had never shared, expecting him to respond as though he had lived them. It was not a game or an act in Nero's mind. The illusion was reality. Sporus's life narrowed to the confines of the palace. He ate at Nero's side, walked with him in the gardens, and accompanied him to private gatherings where select members of the court were allowed to witness the return of the empress. For those who saw them together, the resemblance was undeniable. Whispers began to ripple through the city, though none dared to speak too loudly. Some claimed the gods had indeed resurrected Poppaea. Others said the emperor had gone mad with grief and had ensnared an innocent boy in his delusion. For Sporus, each day was a delicate balance of survival. He had to embody the empress so convincingly that Nero remained pleased, while keeping a small, hidden corner of himself untouched by the role he was forced to play. The danger of failure was constant. A single slip, a gesture too masculine, a word spoken in the wrong tone, could shatter the fragile satisfaction Nero had found, and the consequences of displeasing the emperor were well known. In the rare moments when he was alone, Sporus could feel the weight of his situation pressing down on him. He could not return to his old life. Even if he escaped the palace, he would be recognized instantly. The boy he had been was gone, replaced by a living monument to a woman who had died months before. The transformation was already underway, and though he did not yet know the full extent of what Nero intended, he sensed that his body and mind would not remain entirely his own for long. The day Nero claimed Sporus as his own did not come with the grandeur of a public announcement or the ceremony of a royal decree. It happened quietly, but with the same finality as the closing of a prison door. In the imperial court, possession did not require paperwork, it required will, and Nero's will was absolute. From the moment the emperor uttered the words, "She has returned," Sporus ceased to exist as a separate person. Nero spoke of him not as a boy or as a servant, but as if he truly were Poppaea Sabina. He corrected anyone who referred to Sporus by his given name, making it clear that this error would not be tolerated. For the courtiers and servants, the message was unmistakable. To call him anything but Poppaea was to risk the emperor's wrath. In the days that followed, Nero's claim became more visible. Sporus was moved into the empress's former apartments, lavish rooms draped in silks, scented with the same perfumes Poppaea had once favored. Every object in those chambers was a relic of her presence: ivory combs, bronze mirrors, cosmetics imported from the East, fine glass vessels still stained with traces of her oils. These were not simply luxuries, they were tools of transformation. Each day, attendants dressed Sporus in gowns once worn by the empress, fastening golden clasps at his shoulders, arranging his hair in her signature style and painting his lips with the same deep reds she had chosen for public appearances. Nero himself oversaw these details with an almost theatrical precision. He would stand behind Sporus as he was being adorned, adjusting a strand of hair here, tilting his chin there, murmuring instructions as though coaxing a memory from the past. When the boy looked into the polished bronze mirror, he no longer saw himself. The face staring back was softened by powders, framed by curls, and marked with the faint, ghostly shadow of a woman who had been dead for months. The emperor's fascination with his returned wife quickly extended beyond the privacy of the palace. He began bringing Sporus to small gatherings of trusted courtiers, hosting dinners where the most influential men and women of Rome were confronted with the unsettling spectacle of their dead empress seated beside the emperor as though nothing had changed. The reactions were careful, measured. Outwardly, they offered polite smiles and murmured respectful greetings. Inwardly, many were unsettled, but no one dared to speak of it openly. Rome was a city where the wrong whisper could cost a life. It was at one such gathering that Nero made his claim fully public to those who mattered most. As the wine flowed and the music played softly in the background, he rose from his seat and gestured towards Sporus with a flourish. "My Poppaea," he said, "has returned to me." The statement was delivered not as an announcement, but as a truth so obvious it required no explanation. The room responded with applause, the kind that was more about survival than celebration. From that moment, Sporus's presence became a fixture at Nero's side. Whether in the gardens, at private banquets, or in the imperial box at the theater, he was there, dressed in flowing robes and adorned with jewels. The city began to take notice. Gossip spread in hushed tones through the marketplaces and bathhouses. Some claimed Nero had discovered a miraculous twin or a distant relation of the empress. Others believed the emperor had lost his mind entirely. A few, in the safety of their own homes, whispered the truth, that the boy was neither Poppaea nor any relative, but a victim molded into her likeness by the emperor's unrelenting will. Inside the palace, Sporus's days blurred into a ritual of performance. Each morning began with attendants preparing him for the role he had been forced into. Bathing in perfumed water, being draped in silks, having his hair arranged in elaborate coils. He was instructed in Poppaea's mannerisms by women who had once served the empress, how she held her goblet, how she inclined her head when listening, the exact rhythm of her speech. Even his voice was coached to soften its pitch, to match the delicate tone Nero remembered. Every smile, every glance, every movement became part of the act. At first, Sporus tried to resist in subtle ways, slight shifts in expression. Pauses where Poppaea might have spoken, but Nero noticed. The emperor's corrections were never shouted. Instead, they were quiet, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of implied threat. "She would not look away like that," he would say softly, or "her hand would rest here." The message was clear, the illusion was not to be broken. The more Sporus was claimed, the more isolated he became. His old life, his name, his identity, these things faded like the memory of a dream upon waking. The few servants who had known him before the transformation avoided meeting his eyes. In their silence there was pity, but also fear. Nero's power was not simply political, it was personal, invasive, and total. The emperor's claim over Sporus was not confined to the palace walls. When Nero traveled through the city, Sporus rode with him in the imperial carriage, his presence a living declaration of the emperor's will. At religious ceremonies, he stood beside Nero, receiving the same offerings and honors that had once been given to Poppaea. Foreign envoys who came to negotiate with Rome were introduced to him as the empress, and though some were startled, all followed the Roman court's lead in addressing him as such. To the outside world, this might have appeared as a bizarre act of grief or a grotesque display of vanity. But within the palace, it was more than that. It was possession made flesh. Nero had not merely found someone to replace Poppaea. He had taken a living human being and declared them to be her erasing their past and binding them entirely to his own delusion. There was no distinction between memory and reality, between the dead and the living. In Nero's mind, Sporus was not pretending. He was Poppaea restored to him by fate, or perhaps by the sheer force of his own will. For Sporus, the claim was a cage that grew smaller with each passing day. Every glance from the emperor was a reminder that he no longer belonged to himself. Every public appearance was a performance he could not escape. The world might have believed they were witnessing an extraordinary love story, the reunion of an emperor and his beloved. But for the boy behind the silks and jewels, it was the slow, relentless erasure of everything he had ever been. The transformation began as a performance, but soon it became something far more permanent, something that could never be undone. At first, Nero had been content to clothe Sporus in Poppaea's silks, drape her jewelry across his neck, and style his hair in the familiar coils that once crowned the empress. But costumes and cosmetics were not enough for a man whose will was sharpened by obsession. To Nero, Sporus was not a boy acting as Poppaea. He was Poppaea, and any detail that reminded him otherwise was an imperfection to be corrected. The emperor's mind had no tolerance for flaws. The decision, when it came, was presented not as a question but as a decree. There was no discussion, no moment of consent. Nero simply announced that Sporus was to be remade so completely that even the gods would be deceived. This meant removing the final, undeniable markers of his masculinity. In the cold language of the imperial court, the act was necessary for the role. In reality, it was mutilation, castration, ordered by the most powerful man in the empire. The preparations were handled in secrecy, though not in shame. Within the palace, a surgeon was summoned, one of those skilled enough to tend to the emperor himself, a man whose loyalty outweighed any moral hesitation. Sporus was told what would happen only when it could no longer be avoided. His protests, if there were any, were swallowed by the knowledge of where he stood. In Rome, disobedience to the emperor could end in exile, torture, or death. Compared to those fates, perhaps even this violation seemed survivable. The procedure was brutal, the tools crude by modern standards. It was done under the cold watch of attendants who looked everywhere but at Sporus's face. There was no mercy in the act, no gentleness, and when it was over, the boy lay weakened, his body forever changed. In that moment, a line had been crossed. He could no longer return to his old life, not even in secret. The transformation was no longer something he wore. It was carved into him. As he recovered, the pace of his reshaping accelerated. Nero oversaw every detail as if he were directing a masterpiece. Sporus's clothing became more elaborate, his cosmetics more precise. His voice was trained to a softer, higher tone. He was taught to walk with a gliding step, to hold his arms in the delicate curves of noblewomen, to lower his eyes when addressed in public. All of these details, Nero insisted, were simply restoring what had once been. But the transformation was not only physical, it was psychological. The emperor did not allow Sporus to speak of himself as anyone other than Poppaea. Servants were instructed to reinforce the illusion at all times. They addressed him as Augusta, the title of the empress, and deferred to him in the same ceremonial ways they once had to her. Even in private, Nero spoke to him as though they were continuing a marriage interrupted by death. He would reminisce about moments they had never shared, walks in gardens, whispered conversations, the touch of a hand. And though Sporus had no part in those memories, he was expected to respond as though he remembered them too. At first, these demands might have seemed like the eccentricities of a grieving man, but over time, they became rules of survival. Sporus learned that any slip, a wrong expression, a hesitation before answering to Poppaea, was met with the emperor's displeasure. Nero's anger was rarely explosive. It was worse than that. It was cold, quiet, and deliberate, the kind of disfavor that could turn an imperial favorite into a corpse without warning. The transformation also began to extend beyond the palace. When Nero appeared in public, Sporus accompanied him dressed in the full regalia of the empress, layered gowns, heavy necklaces, rings set with enormous gems. The crowds, accustomed to spectacle, stared in awe and confusion. Some whispered that the gods had performed a miracle. Others murmured that their emperor was flaunting his madness for all to see. But in Rome, such whispers stayed behind closed doors. The penalty for ridiculing the emperor's choices was too great. Nero reveled in the attention. He would lead Sporus into the imperial box at the theater, allow him to be seen at religious festivals, and even have him presented to visiting dignitaries as the Empress Poppaea, restored to me. The foreign envoys, baffled but wary, played along. They understood that diplomacy often required ignoring the truth when it was politically dangerous to speak it. Behind the public appearances, Sporus's daily life was one of constant rehearsal. He was drilled on Poppaea's history, mannerisms, and speech patterns until they were second nature. He learned the names of her friends, her enemies, her favorite poets, her preferred scents. Nero would test him without warning, asking what they had discussed years before, or how she had reacted to a certain festival. The correct answer was whatever Nero wished to hear. In the palace gardens, Nero would sometimes walk with Sporus for hours, speaking in low, tender tones. He would point to certain flowers and say, "You always loved these," or gesture toward a fountain and recall, "We stood here the night you told me." These conversations blurred the line between delusion and reality until even Sporus, forced to live within them, felt the boundaries of his own identity fraying. He was still himself somewhere deep inside, but that self was buried under layers of imposed memory and performance. The emperor's obsession was not without its moments of cruelty disguised as affection. Nero would compare Sporus to Poppaea aloud, sometimes praising the resemblance, other times criticizing him for failing to capture her essence. "Your smile was softer before," he would say, or "She would never have turned her head so quickly." These remarks were not idle observations. They were commands for further change. Every step of this transformation reinforced a single, chilling truth: Sporus was not merely meant to resemble Poppaea. He was meant to replace her entirely. Nero's mourning had twisted into something darker, a refusal to accept death, a need to control life itself. And in the emperor's mind, that control could only be complete when every trace of the boy's original identity was gone. By the time the transformation reached its peak, there was little left of the person Sporus had once been. His body had been altered, his name erased, his voice and movements reshaped. In the eyes of the court, he was no longer a boy who had been taken by the emperor. He was the empress, resurrected through the will of Rome's most dangerous man. And in Nero's mind, this was not a perversion or a crime. It was a triumph over the limits of mortality. But for Sporus, it was the quiet death of the self, the slow erasure of everything he had known. The boy had been replaced by a figure who existed only to satisfy the obsession of a man who could command anything and have it done. And there was no escape, for the transformation was not only complete, it was irreversible. Nero's obsession did not end with the transformation. In fact, once Sporus had been molded into the image of Poppaea, the emperor's demands shifted from the private and domestic to the public and ceremonial. It was no longer enough for Sporus to be Poppaea in the confines of the palace. He had to be Poppaea before the eyes of Rome, before the world itself. This was the stage upon which Nero truly thrived, and his new empress would be the centerpiece of his grand performance. The public unveiling came during one of Rome's lavish festivals. The streets were alive with the sounds of musicians, the smell of roasting meats, and the glitter of gold, threaded banners fluttering in the summer air. Citizens crowded the main avenues, eager to see their emperor. When the imperial carriage appeared, it was not Nero alone who drew their eyes. It was the figure seated beside him, draped in shimmering silk the color of ripe pomegranates, crowned with a diadem that caught the sun like fire. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some recognized the robes, the jewels, the very style of the hair. Poppaea Sabina's image returned to life, but they also knew she had died. This contradiction lingered in the air like incense smoke. Those who were loyal, or simply careful, knelt and shouted blessings. Others whispered behind their hands, eyes darting nervously for fear of being overheard. Nero basked in the reaction. He raised Sporus's hand before the crowd, presenting him as though unveiling a divine gift. The cheers grew louder, not from devotion but from survival. Rome knew how to play along when the emperor's mood was at stake. To deny the illusion would be dangerous. To embrace it, however false, was safer. From that day forward, Sporus's presence in public life became routine. He appeared beside Nero at the theatre, in the imperial box where all eyes could study him. He rode in processions, walked in temple ceremonies, and attended the games, seated in a place of honor where the empress would have sat. Nero seemed delighted by the unease this caused. To him, the blurring of life and death, truth and falsehood, was not a weakness. It was a demonstration of his power over reality itself. But the pageantry was more than just a display of control. It was also an act of propaganda. Nero's reign was plagued by unrest, political conspiracies, grain shortages, growing resentment among the Senate. The site of Poppaea, restored, served as a distraction, a talking point that drew attention away from the empire's problems. It was as if he was saying, "Knock at this miracle I have given you. How could you question the man who can bring back the dead?" For Sporus, each public outing was another step deeper into the role he could not refuse. Every movement, every word, every smile had to be calculated. In private, he had learned to mimic Poppaea's mannerisms under Nero's watchful eye. Now, he had to perfect them before thousands of spectators. Any slip, however small, would be noticed, and worse, it would be noticed by Nero. The pressure was relentless, a constant strain that left no room for the boy he had once been. The transformation of his daily life was complete. When Nero dined with senators, Sporus sat beside him, draped in pearls and offering small, graceful gestures as the empress might have. When Nero attended religious rites, Sporus played the part of Augusta, accepting the blessings of priests who knew better than to question the charade. Foreign envoys, when introduced to him, bowed and addressed him as Poppaea, no matter how strange they found it. The most disturbing of these public performances came when Nero arranged an imperial wedding between himself and Sporus. The event was staged with full ceremony, witnessed by members of the court and guarded by the Praetorian Guard. Sporus was dressed as a bride, veiled in gold, led to the altar where Nero placed a ring upon his hand. The vows, the feast, the celebrations, all followed Roman wedding tradition, as though the emperor were marrying a woman of noble birth. The fact that Sporus was a castrated boy was not mentioned, not acknowledged. To question it was to risk one's life. This marriage was not a symbolic gesture for Nero. It was, in his mind, the completion of his victory over death. The union allowed him to live in the fantasy that Poppaea had truly returned, that their marriage had simply continued as if her death had been a bad dream. In the emperor's eyes, he had defied fate itself. But behind the silks and jewels, behind the smiles offered to the crowds, Sporus lived in a state of quiet horror. The wedding was not a choice. It was a declaration that his identity was gone forever. In the eyes of Rome, he was not merely a replacement, he was Poppaea. The boy named Sporus no longer existed in public memory. The more visible he became, the more the palace walls closed in on him. There was no escaping the gaze of the court, no moment when he could let the mask slip. Even in private, Nero's delusion left no room for him to be himself. The emperor's conversations were always about their past, their love, their shared moments, none of which had ever been his. To refuse to play along would be to shatter the illusion, and that was unthinkable. The cruelty of it all was that Nero seemed to believe this was a gift. He treated Sporus with the luxuries of an empress, fine clothing, feasts, jewels, servants at his beck and call. But these were not acts of kindness, they were chains made of gold, binding him ever tighter to the role. A prisoner in finery was still a prisoner. In the streets, People spoke cautiously of the emperor's strange bride. Some claimed it was a sign of divine favor, others that it was proof of Nero's madness. The Senate, too cautious to oppose him outright, smiled and bowed when in his presence, then muttered disapproval in private. No one dared to act. After all, many in Rome had already seen what happened to those who crossed Nero: senators driven to suicide, generals exiled, entire families destroyed. As the months passed, Sporus's public role became as ingrained in Rome's life as the games or the festivals. Children whispered about the empress who had returned from the grave. Merchants sold trinkets bearing her likeness, using the imperial image to make a profit. And all the while, the boy inside the silks and diadems was fading further into the shadows of his own mind. Nero had succeeded in making the illusion real, not because the people believed it, but because no one dared to challenge it. And in that silence, in that collective act of willful blindness, Sporus's identity was buried deeper than Poppaea herself had ever been. What had begun as a grotesque act of grief had become a spectacle the whole empire participated in, willingly or not. Rome was now part of the lie, and Sporus was its living proof. For the emperor, this was victory. For the boy, it was a sentence without end. The marriage had bound Sporus even more tightly to Nero, but it also placed him in a far more dangerous position than before. Inside the imperial palace, relationships were not merely personal, they were political weapons. Every glance, every whisper, every gesture carried weight. And now, as the emperor's wife, Sporus became the focus of both envy and suspicion. The court was a nest of factions, each competing for influence. Some saw Sporus as a means to gain Nero's favor. Others viewed him as a threat to their own standing. Senators who once courted Poppaea's support now sought the approval of her living double. Courtiers delivered gifts, exquisite fabrics, rare perfumes, intricate jewelry, in hopes that Sporus would speak kindly of them to the emperor. But just as many searched for ways to undermine him, to find some flaw in his performance that could be exposed. For Sporus, this was another layer of the trap. He was forced to navigate the dangerous currents of palace politics while continuing to maintain the role Nero demanded of him. He had to remember the endless lessons drilled into him about Poppaea's past friendships and rivalries, about which noble families she had favored and which she had shunned. One wrong word could set in motion a chain of resentment, and resentment at court often ended in exile or death. Nero himself, though obsessed with Sporus, was not constant in his moods. His affection could turn to suspicion with frightening speed. On some days, he treated Sporus with lavish tenderness, presenting him with new gowns and praising his beauty before the court. On others, he grew cold and distant, his eyes searching for some imagined sign of betrayal. These mood shifts were made worse by Nero's growing paranoia. He had already executed family members and political allies on mere suspicion of disloyalty. Sporus knew that a single moment of displeasure could mean the end of his life. Outside the palace, Rome was restless. The great fire of a few years earlier still haunted the city, and though Nero had rebuilt much of it, resentment simmered among the population. Grain shortages and heavy taxation added to the tension. The emperor's public appearances with Sporus, once a source of fascination, began to provoke murmurs of discontent. Some citizens saw the lavish displays as an insult in a time of hardship. Others whispered that Nero was more concerned with his fantasy marriage than with ruling the empire. Yet Nero persisted. He staged elaborate public events in which Sporus played a central role: religious processions, banquets for visiting dignitaries, and theatrical performances where the emperor himself sang and acted. Sporus was expected to sit in the imperial box, adorned in jewels, smiling at the spectacle, as though he were witnessing Rome at its height, rather than its decline. One of the most unsettling aspects of this period was how completely Nero had blurred the lines between performance and reality. In his mind, Sporus was not acting, he was Poppaea, and their life together was as genuine as any marriage could be. This delusion extended into the most private moments. Nero would speak to Sporus late into the night about events from there, past weaving stories that combined truth, memory, and invention until they became indistinguishable. If Sporus hesitated or failed to respond with the expected emotion, the emperor's expression would darken, and the conversation would end abruptly. There were moments when Sporus considered escape, but the thought quickly withered under the weight of reality. The imperial palace was not simply a residence. It was a fortress, guarded day and night by the Praetorian Guard, men loyal to Nero and paid to ensure his will was carried out without question. Beyond the palace walls lay a city where every ear could be listening, every eye watching for a sign of disloyalty to the emperor. Even if he could flee Rome, where could he go? He was too well known, too recognizable in his silks and jewels. It was during this time that Sporus began to understand a deeper cruelty of his situation. Nero had not simply stolen his body and his freedom, he had stolen his very identity. If Sporus appeared before the public without the empress's attire, many would not recognize him at all. Others would still address him as Poppaea, not out of ignorance, but because it was safer to uphold the lie than to acknowledge the truth. He was trapped not only by the emperor's will, but by the collective complicity of everyone around him. The psychological toll was immense. Sporus lived each day in a state of hyper-awareness, every gesture measured, every word weighed. His reflection in the polished bronze mirrors of the palace was no longer his own. The face that stared back at him was softer, painted, framed by carefully arranged curls. It was beautiful in a way, but it was not him. It was a mask he could never remove. Nero's obsession, however, was beginning to show signs of strain. His reign was becoming more unstable, marked by rumors of rebellion in the provinces and discontent among the legions. The emperor, who had once reveled in public adoration, now spent more time behind palace walls, venturing out only for grand performances that felt increasingly desperate. When he did appear, Sporus was always by his side, the living emblem of the emperor's defiance against mortality. One evening, Nero hosted an opulent banquet for a visiting delegation from the east. The feast was a display of Rome's wealth, tables laden with exotic meats, musicians playing in every corner, dancers weaving between the guests. Sporus, seated beside the emperor, smiled and spoke graciously to the dignitaries, responding to their formal greetings as Poppaea would have. But he could feel their eyes studying him, searching for the truth behind the illusion. Whether they believed it or not, they did not challenge it. After the guests had departed, Nero seemed unusually quiet. He paced the marble floors, speaking in low tones to himself. Finally, he turned to Sporus and said something that froze the boy's blood. "You are all I have left that cannot betray me." It was meant as a declaration of trust, but to Sporus it was a reminder that he was not loved, he was possessed. His existence was valuable to Nero only as long as the fantasy remained intact. The statement haunted him in the days that followed. It revealed the fragility of his position. If Nero ever decided that Sporus had betrayed him, even in some imagined way, there would be no protection, no mercy. The emperor had destroyed men for less. Meanwhile, whispers of unrest grew louder. News reached Rome of uprisings in the provinces, of generals whose loyalty to Nero was uncertain. The Senate grew restless, sensing that the emperor's grip on power was weakening. In the palace, this tension was palpable. Guards stood more alert, messengers came and went at all hours, and Nero himself seemed more irritable, more prone to sudden bursts of rage. Sporus watched all of this from the place at Nero's side, knowing that if the emperor fell, his own fate would likely be sealed with him. The boy who had once been a private citizen had been turned into a symbol of imperial delusion, and symbols were often destroyed when regimes collapsed. But there was no way to prepare, no way to shield himself from the storm he knew was coming. And yet, in those final calm days before events began to spiral toward the inevitable, the role continued. Sporus still dressed as the empress each morning, still walked beside Nero in the gardens, still endured the whispered questions of foreign envoys and the watchful eyes of the court. The illusion held, barely, but it was beginning to tremble under the weight of the empire's gathering unrest. By the beginning of 68 AD, the cracks in Nero's empire were no longer hairline fractures. They were gaping wounds. Rebellions had erupted in the provinces, led by governors and generals who no longer feared the emperor's wrath. In Rome itself, the Senate's patience was wearing thin. For years, they had tolerated Nero's extravagances, his artistic performances, and even the grotesque spectacle of his marriage to Sporus. But now, the empire's stability was at stake, and whispers of replacing him grew louder in the marble corridors of power. For Sporus, these shifting tides brought no relief. If anything, they made his position more precarious. As Nero's world narrowed under the threat of insurrection, he clung to his illusions with even greater desperation. Public appearances became fewer, but when they occurred, they were even more elaborate than before. The emperor, desperate to project strength and control, paraded Sporus through the streets in golden carriages, as though the sight of his wife could remind the people of Rome's imperial glory. The citizens, however, no longer watched with the same awe. Some muttered insults as the procession passed, others turned away entirely. The spell was breaking. Inside the palace, paranoia gripped every corner. The Praetorian Guard, once utterly loyal to Nero, began to show signs of uncertainty. Rumors spread of secret meetings between senators and military leaders. Messengers arrived at odd hours, delivering news that seemed to worsen with each day. Legions defecting to rebel commanders, provincial cities declaring independence, grain shipments intercepted. Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic. Some days he shut himself away in his private chambers with Sporus, demanding that the boy perform old rituals of affection and conversation exactly as Poppaea once had. He would reminisce about events that had never happened, recalling walks through gardens that Sporus had never seen, or feasts with guests long dead. It was as though Nero's mind had begun to rewrite reality itself, making the past bend to his will just as he had bent Sporus's life into a grotesque mirror of the dead empress. On other days, Nero's moods turned black and violent. Servants were beaten for imagined slights, officials dismissed without cause. At one banquet, when a courtier failed to laugh at one of the emperor's jokes, Nero ordered his execution the following morning. Sporus learned to speak less and smile more, to avoid being noticed in moments when Nero's temper flared. His role was no longer simply to maintain the illusion. It was to survive it. Outside the palace walls, the rebellion led by Galba, the governor of Hispania, began to gather unstoppable momentum. Galba declared himself the rightful ruler of Rome and secured the loyalty of several legions. This was no longer a distant threat. It was a march toward the capital. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, began to maneuver for its own survival. Many of those who had once cheered Nero and flattered Sporus now avoided them altogether, offering only cold formalities when duty required. One evening, as the scent of smoke from distant fires drifted over the city, Nero summoned Sporus to his private garden. The emperor paced under the moonlight, speaking not to the boy but seemingly to the shadows themselves. He ranted about betrayal, by the Senate, by the people, even by the gods. Then he turned suddenly to Sporus, and with a softness that was almost more terrifying than his rage, said, "If I die, you will come with me. You will not live in a world without me." It was not a threat in the ordinary sense. It was a statement of fact, a decision already made in the emperor's mind. Sporus stood frozen, unsure whether to protest or nod in agreement. In truth, there was nothing to say. The following days were a blur of chaos. Galba's forces advanced closer to Rome, and the Praetorian Guard, seeing the writing on the wall, began to abandon Nero. Courtiers fled the palace under cover of night, taking with them whatever treasures they could carry. Sporus watched the imperial household shrink as fear hollowed it out. Nero, refusing to accept the reality of his situation, ordered preparations for one final grand procession, as if pageantry could hold back the tide of rebellion. That procession never happened. In early June, word arrived that the Senate had declared Nero a public enemy. To be stripped of the title of emperor was one thing, to be declared an outlaw was another. It meant that anyone could kill him without consequence. The man who had once ruled the known world now found himself hunted. In the dead of night, Nero fled the palace with a small group of loyalists, Sporus among them. They slipped through the darkened streets, avoiding the main roads, heading toward a villa outside the city. Nero, dressed not in imperial robes but in a simple tunic and cloak, seemed almost unrecognizable. Yet even in this desperate moment, he insisted that Sporus remain by his side, addressing him as Poppaea, as though nothing had changed. At the villa, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Nero's remaining allies urged him to flee farther, to reach the coast and escape by sea, but each plan was abandoned as quickly as it was made. Reports came in that Galba's forces were already blocking the key roads, and the Praetorians had fully defected. Nero's face, pale and drawn, seemed to age years in hours. In those final moments, Sporus became less a companion and more a witness. He watched as the emperor raged, then wept, then sat in silence staring at the floor. Nero asked him to sing, to recite lines from plays they had performed together in the palace, as if clinging to their shared performances might keep the truth at bay. Sporus obeyed, his voice steady even as his thoughts churned with dread. The breaking point came when messengers brought word that soldiers were on their way to arrest him. Nero, unwilling to face public humiliation, decided on suicide. But even this act, like everything else in his life, became a kind of theater. He spoke of how Rome would weep for him, how his death would be a tragedy worthy of song. Then, in a moment that would haunt Sporus forever, he turned to the boy and said, "Do not forget. You are mine in life and in death." When Nero finally pressed the blade to his throat, it was with the help of a servant, his hands trembling too much to complete the act alone. The Emperor of Rome died not on a battlefield or in the Senate chambers, but in a suburban villa, far from the marble grandeur of the Palatine Hill. Sporus, standing in the corner, felt no triumph, no release, only a strange emptiness. But his ordeal was far from over. The man who had remade him into a living ghost was gone, but the identity Nero had forced upon him remained. Those who found them at the villa addressed him as Poppaea, without hesitation, as though the delusion had outlived its creator. The chains were still there, invisible but unbreakable, and now, without Nero to shield or control him, Sporus would face a different kind of danger, one that might prove even deadlier than the emperor's obsession. When Nero's body lay cooling in that dim villa outside Rome, the empire did not pause for mourning. Power in Rome was never still. It shifted instantly to the next man able to grasp it. Galba, the governor of Hispania who had declared himself emperor, wasted no time in securing his claim. His entry into the city was not accompanied by the chaotic spectacle Nero had loved, but by an iron discipline that made clear a new order was in place. Yet in the shadows of this transition, there remained the question of what to do with the strange figure Nero had left behind, the boy who looked like Poppaea Sabina. Sporus, now without his imperial captor, found himself in a position that was both precarious and grotesquely valuable. To the common people, he was a curiosity, a whispered legend walking among them. To the elite, he was a dangerous reminder of Nero's madness, something to be hidden away or destroyed. But there were others who saw in him a tool. Rome was a city that thrived on appearances, and Sporus's appearance, crafted and preserved with obsessive detail, was a weapon that could be wielded in political games. It did not take long for him to fall under the control of one such man, Vitellius Sabinus, the Praetorian Guard prefect who had played a key role in betraying Nero. Vitellius was ambitious, dangerously so. Though Galba now sat on the throne, the prefect harbored his own imperial dreams. He imagined himself not merely as a power behind the throne, but as the throne itself, and what better way to capture the imagination of the people than to align himself with Poppaea, the empress reborn. The arrangement was simple and chilling. Sporus would be paraded through the city beside Vitellius, not as a lover or a political partner, but as a symbol a silent, living echo of the Julian-Claudian dynasty, as if the dead empress herself endorsed this new contender for the purple. Rome's people had a weakness for spectacle, and Nymphidius intended to exploit it. So once again, Sporus was draped in silks, his hair curled and perfumed, his face painted into the mask that had erased his boyhood. The streets they walked were different now, dirtier, more dangerous, patrolled by soldiers loyal to shifting factions. But the stares he received were the same. Some citizens knelt as he passed, murmuring blessings to the empress. Others spat on the ground, muttering curses for the decadent memory of Nero. Sporus felt neither connection nor contempt for these reactions. They were for a ghost, not for him. Nymphidius's ambitions, however, were too large for his own good. In the summer of 68 AD, he attempted to seize power outright, convinced that Praetorian Guard would back his claim over the aging Galba, but the Guard, pragmatic as ever, decided they preferred a steady hand over another plunge into chaos. They turned on him before his plans could unfold. Nymphidius was cut down, his corpse left in the barracks courtyard as a warning to anyone else who might overreach. Sporus, once again, was without a master. But this did not mean freedom. In Rome, the high-born and the powerful did not see him as a person. They saw him as a rare and dangerous possession. To control Sporus was to control the memory of Nero and Poppaea, to hold a living fragment of the last dynasty. That kind of power could not be left wandering the streets. He was taken into the custody of Otho, a man with his own tangled history with Poppaea Sabina. Before she had become Nero's wife, she had been married to Otho, and many believed she had been taken from him by the emperor himself. Otho, now a rising political figure, saw in Sporus both a haunting reminder and a potent symbol. Whether his interest was rooted in nostalgia, resentment, or pure political calculation, he wasted no time in binding Sporus to his side. Otho's treatment of Sporus was different from Nero's, but not kinder. Where Nero's obsession had been rooted in a delusional grief, Otho's was calculated. He hosted public events where Sporus appeared dressed as the empress, sometimes seated beside him as if they were a married couple. To the watching Senate and people, it was a statement that Otho had reclaimed what Nero had stolen from him, that the connection between him and Poppaea had been restored, if only in appearance. Sporus's life settled into yet another cycle of performance. The gowns were familiar, the cosmetics the same, the mannerisms still expected. But the atmosphere had shifted. Nero had lived in a world of self-created fantasy, caring little for political consequences. Otho was a man of politics, and Sporus was not a fantasy to him, but a prop. Every gesture, every public appearance was part of a strategy. And like any prop, Sporus could be discarded the moment he ceased to be useful. It was during this period that Sporus began to realize the full extent of his erasure. He had not been allowed to reclaim his name or his voice. He was summoned only when needed, dismissed without thought. No one asked his opinion, no one cared for his comfort. He had become a ceremonial object, taken out for display, stored away in silence. The role Nero had forced upon him had not died with the emperor. It had become his permanent prison. The political climate in Rome remained unstable. Galba's reign was short-lived, ending in assassination, and Otho seized the throne. Sporus found himself once again at the center of imperial life, though not in the way he might once have imagined. Otho, now emperor, continued to present him publicly as Poppaea, a living echo of a past that lent his reign an air of legitimacy. But the reality behind the facade was darker. The empire was fracturing under the weight of competing generals, each commanding legions loyal only to themselves. Otho's time as emperor would prove brief. Vitellius, commander of the Rhine legions, marched on Rome and civil war erupted. As battles raged across Italy, Sporus remained in the capital, a silent ornament in the palace while soldiers bled in the streets. The chaos outside was a distant roar compared to the quiet suffocation of his daily existence. When news came that Otho had taken his own life rather than prolong the bloodshed, Sporus felt the same strange emptiness he had known at Nero's death. Another ruler gone, Another chain of possession broken, but the freedom he might have hoped for did not arrive. The palace was seized by Vitellius's men, and with it, Sporus passed into yet another set of hands. Vitellius was not a man of subtlety or romantic delusion. To him, Sporus was an amusement, a curiosity to be displayed for the entertainment of his court. In drunken feasts, he would force the boy to recount stories of Nero's final days, to describe in detail the late emperor's behavior. Sometimes he would parade Sporus before foreign envoys, introducing him mockingly as the Empress of Rome. These humiliations were public, stripping away even the small measure of dignity that Nero's and Otho's obsessions had afforded him. It was during one of these feasts that Sporus first heard whispers of what Vitellius intended for him. The emperor was planning a grotesque public ceremony. He would force Sporus to play the role of a bride in a mock wedding, marrying him to one of his favorites, and then subject him to further humiliations before the Roman crowd. The idea was to mock not only Sporus, but also the memory of Nero himself, turning the dead emperor's twisted love story into a vulgar joke for the masses. For Sporus, this was different from every other cruelty he had endured. Nero had sought to possess him, Otho to use him, but Vitellius meant to destroy him utterly, publicly, irreversibly, stripping away any shred of humanity he had left. The thought of standing in the arena before thousands of jeering faces, dressed once again as Poppaea, but this time as the centerpiece of a grotesque comedy, was more than he could bear. And so, with the last remnants of control over his own life, Sporus made his decision. Before the day of the ceremony could arrive, he would take the only escape left to him. Death, which had claimed Nero, Nymphidius, Otho, and so many others in the violent churn of Rome's politics, would claim him as well, but on his own terms. In that final choice, there was no performance, no mask, no Poppaea. There was only Sporus, reclaiming the smallest fragment of the identity that had been stolen from him. The palace was quiet in the hours before dawn, but Rome itself never slept. Outside the high walls, the night air carried the sounds of a city that had seen too much blood, too much ambition, too much cruelty to be lulled by the darkness. Sporus sat in his chamber, lit by a single oil lamp, staring at his reflection in a polished bronze mirror. The face that looked back at him was the same face the world had been forced to accept as Poppaea Sabina, a face shaped by the demands of an emperor long dead. Yet to him, it felt like the face of a stranger. He could not remember when the boy named Sporus had truly vanished, only that one day he had been gone, replaced by a ghost. He thought of Nero, not with longing, but with a grim understanding. The emperor had been obsessed with recreating what he had lost, blind to the human cost of his obsession. Sporus had been that cost. He had been plucked from his life, reshaped, painted, and displayed like an object. Nero had spoken to him in gentle tones when they were alone, convincing himself that what he did was an act of love. Yet the love had been for a dead woman, never for the living boy trapped in her shadow. Otho had been different. His claim on Sporus was calculated, a political maneuver rather than a personal madness. But the result had been the same: the silk robes, the jewels, the public appearances, the silent compliance expected at every turn. Vitellius, however, had stripped away even the thin veil of civility. His cruelty was naked, deliberate, meant to entertain others at the expense of Sporus's dignity. It was under Vitellius's roof that Sporus learned of the wedding. Not a wedding in any true sense, but a mockery, a staged humiliation where he would be paraded before the Roman people in bridal attire, forced to take part in a grotesque performance designed to ridicule him and the memory of Nero alike. The thought of it twisted in his stomach like a blade. This was not another role to be played for survival, this was annihilation. He weighed his choices carefully, though there were not many. To submit meant allowing himself to become the punchline of a cruel joke, to see the last fragile pieces of himself destroyed in the laughter of the mob. To refuse meant defying the emperor directly, a defiance that would be answered with punishment far worse than death. The third choice, unspoken but present, was the one that offered him a kind of freedom he had not known in years to end his life before the humiliation could begin. The decision came not with rage, but with a cold, almost serene clarity. He had been passed from man to man, from ruler to ruler, each of them reshaping him into what they needed. He had been a wife without consent, a symbol without meaning, a body without a self. In ending his life, he could reclaim, if only for a moment, ownership of that self. Death would not give him back what was lost, but it would prevent Vitellius from taking what little remained. In the dim lamplight, he moved quietly, as though he were preparing for one of the endless ceremonies he had endured. The garments he wore were simple, the plain tunic of a servant rather than the finery of an empress. He had no desire to meet death in costume. There was no audience to impress, no master to please. For the first time in years, he dressed for himself. He sat on the low stool by the mirror, holding the small blade in his hand. It was not the grand, ceremonial dagger of a Roman noble, but a utilitarian knife meant for cutting fruit. Even this felt fitting. His end would not be a spectacle, but a quiet act, unseen by the crowds who had so often consumed his image. The blade caught the lamplight as he turned it in his fingers. His reflection wavered in the polished bronze, the painted face blurring until it seemed almost to dissolve. He thought, fleetingly, of the life he might have lived had he never crossed paths with Nero. Perhaps he would have grown into manhood in anonymity, another face among Rome's countless citizens. Perhaps he would have had the chance to love someone who saw him as he truly was, not as a shadow of someone else. That life was a ghost, no more real now than the empress he had been forced to become. Outside, the faint sounds of movement in the corridors signaled the beginning of the day's activities. Servants would soon arrive to prepare him for the mock wedding. The thought steeled his resolve. He would not be dressed again in the silks of Poppaea, would not walk the path laid out for him like a sacrificial animal. He set the blade against his skin, feeling the sharpness bite gently before the pressure deepened. The pain was immediate but distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Warmth spread across his fingers, and the room seemed to tilt, the lamplight flickering in and out of focus. He kept his eyes on his reflection, watching the painted mask blur and fade. His breathing slowed, and with it, the relentless weight of the years seemed to lift. The servants found him some time later, slumped on the floor beside the mirror, the knife still in his hand. The news spread quickly through the palace. The empress was dead. But those who spoke the words knew the truth. There had been no empress, not really. Only a boy whose name had been taken, whose life had been rewritten to suit the desires of powerful men. Vitellius was furious, not because Sporus had died, but because he had been denied his entertainment. The planned spectacle would never take place. The crowd would never roar with laughter at the emperor's cruelty. In that sense, Sporus's final act was a quiet defiance, one last refusal to play the role assigned to him. Outside the palace, the city carried on. Rome had seen the fall of emperors, the collapse of dynasties, the deaths of countless innocents. One more death, even one so strange and tragic, was nothing to pause for. The markets bustled, the taverns filled, and the chariots raced in the Circus Maximus as though nothing had changed. But for those few who had witnessed his life, the image of Sporus lingered, an unsettling reminder of how absolute power could warp not only the lives it touched, but the very identity of its victims. In the end, there was no monument to mark his resting place, no inscription bearing his name. He was buried quietly, without the fanfare that had marked so much of his life. The silks, the jewels, the titles, they were all gone. Only the truth remained, whispered in the darker corners of Rome, that there had once been a boy who was turned into a dead woman, and that he had chosen death rather than live as a ghost forever. History would remember Nero's madness, Otho's ambition, Vitellius's cruelty. Sporus's name would survive only in the margins, a strange footnote in the chronicles of Rome. But in those margins lies a truth more haunting than the rise and fall of emperors, that the theft of a life, of an identity can be as devastating as the fall of an empire itself. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the reach of history's relentless gaze, the boy named Sporus could finally rest, no longer bound to the mask that had defined him in life. In that silence, he belonged to himself at last.